They called the cops because my cabin looked wrong. No warning, no knock. Just Veronica from the HOA declaring, "We have aesthetic standards in this neighborhood and you don't meet them." That porch built by my grandfather, that landmine for years. And still, I found myself explaining my presence like I was trespassing. But the more I resisted, the more everything around me started shifting. Documents, boundaries, even how people looked at me. It stopped feeling like enforcement. It started feeling like a setup. Comment what you would have done if someone tried to evict you from your own land. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the cabin that October afternoon, breathing in pine and cold mountain air after grueling months buried in Denver's chaos. Weeds had crept through the pathway stones since July, and the wind carried that particular mountain whistle that meant winter was stalking closer. I'd inherited this place from my grandfather 2 years back, but work kept pulling me away. And this time, I planned to stay through winter, maybe even longer, if things worked out the way I hoped they would. The moment I cut the engine, I saw them approaching across the meadow like they'd been waiting behind the tree line, watching for my arrival, like predators sensing fresh meat in their territory. Veronica Hale emerged as if summoned by ownership itself, expression-tied clipboard, clutched like a sword, marching ahead in her designer hiking boots that had clearly never touched actual trail dirt, pristine leather without a single scuff mark. Rick Porter trailed behind her, his finger-strumbling knuckles white as he clutched a manila folder against his chest, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with their nervous energy of someone who knew they were about to witness something unpleasant. I was halfway to my door when Veronica's voice cut through the quiet mountain air like a chainsaw through silence, making even the crows scatter from their perches. "Mr. Bennett, we need to discuss your violation of the Scenic Buffer Ordinance immediately. This escalates to formal proceedings that could cost you significantly." The way she said it, you'd think I'd committed murder instead of just existing on my own property that had been in my family longer than she'd been alive. Longer than most of the houses in this valley had foundations. I kept walking toward my cabin, fishing my keys from my pocket, feeling the familiar weight of the brass key my grandfather had given me 20 years ago, and I was just a kid who loved camping here every summer with him. "I'm not sure what scenic buffer you're talking about, Veronica, but I'm standing on my own land right now. So maybe we can discuss this some other time when I'm not just getting home from a long drive." She actually laughed at that, this sharp, little bark that echoed off the surrounding pines, and made a crow take flight from a nearby branch, cawing in protest at the disturbance of mountain peace. "Your land ends at the property line. Mr. Bennett in this cabin is an eyesore that violates our community standards, which clearly state no structures can be visible from the main road, without approved screening vegetation or architectural modifications." I reached my door, slid the key into the lock, and heard that satisfying click as the mechanism turned, the same sound that had welcomed my family home for 60 years of summers and winters and everything between. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was complaining about my view while I was literally unlocking my own front door, standing on a porch my grandfather built with his own hands using timber from these very woods. I turned to face her with what I hoped looked like patience, even though my hands tightened into fists against words I wanted to say but shouldn't. "This cabin's been here since 1962, which I'm pretty sure predates your HOA by about 40 years. So unless you've invented time travel, we don't have much to discuss about grandfather clauses or historical structures that existed before your rules." Veronica's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Rick finally found his voice, clearing his throat awkwardly like he was about to deliver bad news at a funeral. "Actually, Mr. Bennett, the situation is more complex than simple chronology would suggest, and we should probably discuss the legal ramifications before this gets out of hand for everyone involved." He fumbled with those papers, and I wondered if this was hackersplay or a genuine threat, because the way his hands shook suggested even he wasn't sure which side of legal they were standing on. That's when I noticed the sheriff's cruiser pulling up, dust swirling in the late afternoon. Sun like something out of an old western movie where the law arrives just in time or maybe too late. Deputy Nate Ward stepped out looking tired and slightly annoyed, adjusting his belt as he walked over. And I remembered his father used towfish in our stream back when grandfather was alive. "Afternoon, folks," Ward said gently, cutting Veronica off before she could launch into another speech. "Got a call about a property dispute that needs official documentation. Fourth record, though. I'm hoping we can resolve this peacefully." Veronica practically glowed with satisfaction, gesturing toward my cabin like she was presenting evidence to a jury that would surely convict me of crimes against suburban aesthetics and property values. "Deputy Ward, Perfect timing. We need you to witness this violation and file an official report for our enforcement proceedings against Mr. Bennett's compliance structure that's degrading our entire community's investment. Ward looked at me, then at my cabin, which had been standing longer than most of the houses in the valley, weathered wood, telling stories of decades off seasons, then back at Veronica with clear exhaustion. Ma'am, I ran the property records on my way over Herethra Dispatch, and Mr. Bennett owns this parcel free and clear. Has since the estate transferred 2 years ago after his grandfather passed. He actually pulled out his phone and showed her the county assessor's page. With my name on it, the screen brightness turned up so there could be no mistaking the ownership confirmation. Rick tried one more time, waving those papers like they could demolish my cabin with their mere existence, his voice cracking slightly with desperation. The scenic easement supersedes any grandfathered structures according to statute, the 9th of April 17, and we have the authority to impose daily fines of up to $500 until your Ward just shrugged and walked back to his cruiser, clearly done with the whole situation, leaving me standing there with 2 very frustrated HOA representatives who looked defeated. Fizzlance that followed was beautiful, the kind where you can hear individual pine needles dropping and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, probably wondering what all these humans were doing. After they left, grumbling and zooting dark looks over their shoulders, I decided to check the old barn that sat about 200 feet from Thikabin behind a stand of aspens. Grandfather had used it for equipment storage, keeping his tractor and tools, and I wanted to see if the roof had held up through the summer dust. But when I reached the barn door, something immediately felt wrong, like that sensation when you know someone's been in your space without permission. That padlock hanging there wasn't mine, not even close to the old master lock I'd left there in July when I'd last checked on things. It was newer, shinier, some expensive-looking thing with a serial number etched into the steel, and I realized what this meant for everything. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything, including the serial number, which started with RH237, the fresh scratches. On the hop, where Simeon had pried off my lock, I tried my keys anyway, knowing they wouldn't work, but needing to confirm what my gut already knew about this deliberate violation. The brass key scraped uselessly against the cold steel. Anzamathing had trespassed not just on my land, but into my bloodline. The next morning arrived cold and crystal clear frost painting the meadow silver, like nature's own artwork, as Deputy Ward's cruiser pulled up to the barn at exactly 9 o'clock, like we'd arranged the night before. I'd called him after dinner, explaining the lock situation in detail, and to his credit, he'd agreed to witness whatever we found inside, even bringing his body camera for a Ward hesitated before cutting the lock, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, saying something that made my skin crawl slightly. You sure you want to see what's behind this, Grant? Because once open this door, there's no going back to not knowing what's inside. I suddenly felt like the intruder on my own land, but I nodded anyway, needing to know what someone had hidden in my grandfather's barn without permission or explanation. The lock snapped with a satisfying crack that echoed off the barn walls and probably scared every squirrel within a 4 mile, falling into the dirt with a dull thud that felt like justice. I pulled the door open, Hingis groaning from lack of oil that I'd meant to apply months ago, and we both stared at what was inside Ward, letting out a low whistle of disbelief. A Zeraturn mower crouched in the shadows like it knew it didn't belong there, surrounded by equipment marked with Ridgeview Ho, stenciled in black paint, orange traffic cones still wrapped in plastic like Christmas presents nobody wanted. Ward immediately started recording video with his phone, while his body cam captured everything from his perspective, zooming in on the HOA markings that were clear as day, and impossible to explain away as coincidence. Well, this is certainly interesting, and definitely not what I expected to find in a private barn on private property, he muttered, pulling out evidence bags from his duty belt with practiced efficiency. You mind if I bag some of this as evidence? Particularly that SD card from their trail camera over there that's been aimed at your property for who knows how long. The camera sat mounted on a makeshift tripod, its lens pointed directly through a crack in the barn wall toward my cabin, and the violation felt personal in a way that made my hands clench. Ward sealed the SD card in an evidence bag, signing and dating it with a Sharpie while I watched, making sure the chain of custody was crystal clear from the start with no room for tempering claims. This goes straight to the evidence locker and I'll file a report about unauthorized use of your property. That'll be available for any legal proceedings you might pursue, Ward said, taking more photos. After Ward left with his evidence bags and a promise to file his report by noon, I called Claire Morton, a paralegal from Bozeman who also did GIS mapping work on the side. Frank Dalton had recommended her after his own property dispute years ago. Said she whispered to maps like they were old friends and could find property secrets. Others missed entirely. She arrived that afternoon with her laptop and a banker's box of documents that looked older than both of you combined, spreading them across my kitchen table with the careful precision of someone dealing cards. Grant, you're going to want to sit down for this because it's bigger than just your cabin or even the barn situation with the HOA equipment, she said, pulling up digital overlays. At first, I was annoyed, thinking I'd wasted her time and mimony on something that would turn out to be nothing special, just standard property lines and boring But then, she tapped once on her screen, pointing to a clause buried in the original deed, like show us revealing evidence in a crime film, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. This sentence right here, Thatevarian seems to have missed or ignored. It's your nuclear option against the HOA and anyone else who thinks they can push you around. The original deed from 1947 showed clear as day that the Bennett family trust owned not just the cabin parcel, but for connected parcels labeled A through D. She clicked through the GIS layers with practiced ease, showing how the parcels formed. A perfect 40-acre square that included the entire valley floor from ridge to ridge, every inch of it. Here's the kicker that's going to change everything about this fight, she said, highlighting a section of land in red that ran like a snake through the properties. Parcel D includes the only access road in or out of this valley, which means everyone who lives here has to cross your property to get home tow work to anywhere. The red strip of road on the map looked like a noose they'd accidentally tied around their own necks without realizing it, and I stared at it in disbelief. The original easement document, yellowed with age, but still legally binding, according to the recorder's stamp, contained language that made my jaw drop open in shock at its implications. See this clause here that someone should have read before starting this fight with you about scenic buffers and property violations. Claire pointed to the text with her pen. The easement for road access is explicitly listed as, quote, non-transferable without written consent from the property owner, and it's a record right-of-way from 1947. She pulled up the county recorder office. Digital records on her tablet showing same clause highlighted in the official database that anyone could have checked if they'd done their homework. Your grandfather could grant individuals permission to use the road, which he obviously did for decades without issue, but that permission didn't automatically transfer to any homeowners association. I stared at the screen pieces of a larger puzzle clicking together in my mind like tumblers in a lock, finally aligning after years of being stuck in place. So when Ridgeview HOA formed 5 years ago and started using the road for their residents, claiming it as HOA maintained infrastructure in their documents and fees, Claire smiled like a shark who just spotted dinner swimming too close to the surface, unaware of the danger below. They've been trespassing every single day unless they have your written permission, which I'm guessing they absolutely don't have because no one ever asked for it from you or your grandfather. And the implications were staggering. Every single trip in or out of the valley for 5 years had been technically illegal. Thousands of individual violations if someone wanted to get technical. Frank Dalton stopped by around 4 that afternoon, bringing coffee and his own memories of how things used to be in the valley before the HOA emerged like a plague. Your grandfather was too nice. Grant let everyone use that road for free all these years, never asked for a dime, even when he was paying for repairs out of pocket. Frank had lived here for 30 years, watched the whole valley transform from a quiet mountain retreat to whatever this had become with rules about everything imaginable. When that HOA formed, Veronica just assumed the road came with their properties, never bothered to check the actual paperwork or ask permission from anyone because she thought she could take whatever, and he signed the affidavit Claire had prepared confirming under oath that the HOA had been using the road freely for 5 years without any formal agreement or payment. By evening, my phone was buzzing non-stop with texts from neighbors who'd received Veronica's latest community bulletin via email blast to the entire valley about Mivia. Brian Forster, who lived to lots over and seemed like a reasonable guy caught in the middle, forwarded meth email with a note saying he thought I should see this. Instead of just forwarding it cleanly, he'd actually taken time to highlight something strange in the metadata, a detail that would become important later. She'd actually called my cabin an eyesore in writing threatening daily fines of $500, until I either installed approved screening or removed the structure entirely, which was insane. The bulletin included a photo of my cabin taken from the road, with a telephoto lens annotated with red arrows pointing to supposed violations like unpainted wood and authentic period details. But that evening, after processing everything Claire had shown me, I discovered something else when I went to close the bedroom curtains for the night after a long day. Mounted on a tree about 50 feet from my window was a game camera, its lens pointed directly at my cabin's bedroom window, not at the road or scenic area. I backed away from the window like the glass had teeth, my skin crawling with the realization of how long someone might have been watching me private moments. That wasn't surveillance. For HOA compliance, that was a warning. And I wasn't sure if it was meant for me or someone watching from deeper in the woods. Brian Foster knocked on my door at 7 o'clock the next morning, and he didn't say hello. Just held his phone with white knuckles while glancing over his shoulder every few scans. Grunt, "You need to see this right now before someone realizes what I have and tries to make it disappear completely," he said, stepping inside quickly and closing the door. He pulled up his email on his phone, showing me a forwarded chain that originated from Veronica's official HOA president account with timestamps going back 3 weeks before our confrontation. My wife works part-time doing admin stuff for the mostly filing and data entry, and she accidentally got CC'd on this internal thread that I don't think anyone meant to share. The email header showed verified HOA domain addresses with authentication certificates and the metadata. When I clicked into it traced back to their official server. The thread started innocently enough with discussions about community standards, but quickly devolved into something that looked more like a conspiracy to commit fraud than legitimate HOA business operations. The attachment that made my blood run cold was a PDF showing our property boundaries, but someone had digitally altered the marker points, shifting them about 30 feet to make my cabin look illegal. "This is dated 2 weeks before they confronted you," Brian pointed out, scrolling to the signature section where 3 board members had signed off on these falsified boundaries with digital timestamps. "They planned this whole thing in advance, knew exactly what they were going to claim for they ever showed up at your door with their threats and intimidation tactics." But the real bombshell came when Brian played an audio file that was embedded in one of the replies, apparently from a board meeting. Veronica's voice came through crystal clear on his phone speaker, confident and calculating in a way that made my chest tighten with disgust at what I was hearing. "We bury him in legal fees until he caves and sells for whatever we offer," her voice said with disturbing confidence that suggested experience with this exact strategy. "I've done it successfully in Colorado with a similar situation involving an inherited property, and these mountain people always fold when they see the litigation costs mounting because they can't afford to fight." The ceramic mug in my hand creaked under pressure as I listened to her laugh about destroying families. There was laughter in the background from other board members, but then one voice barely audible said something like, "This seems risky, Veronica," showing cracks in board loyalty. The signature approval sheet in another attachment showed something even more twisted than I expected from this group of suburban warriors playing at being property thieves. Multiple smugness signatures appeared on a petition against my cabin, but Brian zoomed in on several that he recognized from his time in the neighborhood over the years. That's supposed to be Tom Chen's signature, but Tom's been in Japan for 2 months visiting family, posted about it on social media with pictures and everything, he explained, and this one here, claiming to be Sarah Williams. She told me yesterday at the mailbox that she never signed anything about your property and actually thinks the cabin adds character ghost signatures, coerced approvals, whatever you want to call it. This was genuine fraud rather than just HOA overreach or aggressive negotiation tactics. I saved everything to encrypted cloud drives while Brian watched nervously, making sure nothing could disappear if his phone suddenly had an accident or got remotely wiped. "You need to be careful with this information," I told him, creating backups on 3 different services with different passwords for each one just to be safe. "If they find out you have this, they might come after you too, for violating some confidentiality agreement or claim you stole proprietary information." Brian nodded, but stood firm, saying his wife was already looking for a new job anyway, because the environment had become too toxic to tolerate. That afternoon I drove past the eastern boundary of my property to check on some trees and found something that made everything click. Orange traffic cones lined a section of road near my property line with a freshly printed notice about widening for safety scheduled for next week, complete with official-looking permits. But what caught my eye were mired survey stakes placed just last month, sitting right beside their work zone markers, positioned like targets for destruction. They hadn't started grading yet, but the intent was obvious to anyone who understood property lines and how easy it would be to accidentally shift things during construction. The schedule posted showed excavator arriving Monday morning at 6 a.m. conveniently before most people would be awake to document what was happening. I took photos from multiple angles capturing the relationship between my legal survey stakes and their construction zone that mysteriously overlapped onto my land. I called Lydia Moore, the GIS analyst Clara Condit, who specialized in boundary disputes and had experience with falsified surveys as an expert witness in court. She parked her van half off the road when she arrived, muttered to herself in coordinates, and waved off handshakes like physical contact might interfere with her data connection. Within 2 hours, she was carrying equipment that looked like something from a sci-fi movie. Laser measurement tools and GPS units accurate to centime. "Let me show you something interesting that'll blow your mind about what they're trying to pull here," she said after just 15 minutes of work. Her tech mapped every inch of the property and something didn't line up at all with the HOA's version of reality. She tickled between official county GIS layers and the HOA's version they'd been circulating, and the shifted markers lit up in red, like warning lights. Someone with admin access has been editing these boundaries incrementally over the last 6 weeks, probably hoping no one would notice gradual changes versus one dramatic shift. The visual evidence was damning: the original markers versus the edited ones, telling the entire story in one clear image that any jury could understand. Lydia created a time-lapse animation showing the creeping boundary changes, each edit timestamp, and Trassetto-specific user login on the HOA system. "This is an amateur hour work," she said, exporting the files with encrypted backups. "Whoever did this knew enough about GIS to make it look legitimate to casual observers, but they didn't count on forensic analysis of the edit history." She pulled up the metadata showing user ID Vernon_H with login times that corresponded to the edits. Obviously Vernon Hale. The pattern was clear, once laid out chronologically: a deliberate campaign to steal land through digital manipulation rather than honest negotiation. Back at the cabin that evening, compiled everything into organized folders, while the reality of what I was facing started to sink in. This wasn't just about an overzealous president anymore. This was systematic fraud, deliberate manipulation of legal documents, and what looked increasingly like a conspiracy to steal land through exhausting the owner with costs. The audio of Veronica bragging about burying people in legal fees played in my hidden repeat, her confidence suggesting she'd gotten away with this before. As I sat there organizing evidence, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank Dalton that simply said, "Check your email now." When I opened it, I found he'd forwarded me a public records request showing Veronica had done exactly this scheme 5 years ago in Durango. They weren't widening a road for safety next week. They were shrinking my legacy inch by stolen inch. Monday morning came with purpose, as I stared at the sign before hammering it in, and part of me hated what this meant for the community, but other part remembered the lock on my barn. The metal rang against the post like a bell, announcing change that was long overdue. Private road notice, 48-hour grace period before standing in bold black letters on white metal. I'd spent Sunday with Claire drafting the notice to beligibly bulletproof while still being reasonable to my neighbors, offering free temporary passes to any resident who acknowledged the private status. The goal wasn't to punish my neighbors who'd done nothing wrong except believe Veronica's lies, but to establish clear ownership before she could claim prescriptive use or adverse possession. By noon, I'd set up a folding table near the entrance, with a stack of temporary passes, each one numbered and dated with security features valid for 30 days. While we sorted things out, several families stopped by throughout the morning, confused, but cooperative once I explained the situation, signing simple acknowledgements that the road was private property belonging to the Bennett Family Trust. I had no idea this wasn't a public road or even Hope Roadity, Jennifer Martinez said, reading through the single-page document carefully with her reading glasses perched on her nose. Veronica told us when we bought our place 3 years ago that the HOA maintained everything from the HOA driveways, and we were paying for it in our dues monthly. Then she revealed something that increased the moral stakes significantly, saying she'd tried to question the HOA once about road maintenance costs and was intimidated into silence by threats of fines. I heard variations of that story 6 more times before lunch, each family believing they'd bought into a neighborhood with HOA contralead infrastructure that justified the monthly fees they'd been paying religiously. Tom Rodriguez and his were especially understanding, even apologetic about the misunderstanding. Once I explained the situation with documentation to back it up, including the original easement from grandfather's time, My grandfather would have wanted everyone to have access because he was a good neighbor, I told them while printing their temporary pass on the portable printer I'd brought for efficiency. But he also would have expected basic respect for property rights, and definitely wouldn't have tolerated someone trying to steal his land through fraud and intimidation liketh. By 300 p.m., I'd issued 14 passes to grateful neighbors who seemed relieved. This wasn't turning into scorched earth warfare that would make everyone's life miserable for years to come. The 15th vehicle to approach was Veronica's white Lexus, and she didn't slow down, but I caught her eyes in their rearview mirror, not fear but pure fury burning there. Within 2 hours I received a call from someone claiming Tobe from code enforcement, saying they'd received complaints about illegal traffic restrictions on a public thoroughfare that violated state law and federal commerce regulations. So, I need you to check your records again because someone has given you false information, I said calmly, having expected this exact response from Veronica's playbook of intimidation tactics. What's your badge number and callback extension so I can verify this is a legitimate county call and not someone impersonating an official, which would be a federal crime. The caller hesitated, then hung up immediately without providing any information, confirming my suspicion that this was either Veronica or someone she'd recruited to harass me with fake authority. The next morning brought an escalation I'd anticipated but hoped to avoid when a county attorney clerkled about a request for a temporary restraining order based on prescriptive use claims. The HOA is claiming 5 years off uninterrupted use, establishing public access rights through continuous possession. The clerk explained, sounding like she was reading from notes someone had prepared for her with specific legal language. They're seeking an emergent injunction to prevent you from restricting access while the matter is adjudicated, claiming immediate and irreparable harm to property values and emergency service access. I gave her Claire's contact information, and within an hour Claire had submitted our counterfiling, including Frank's affidavit about the true history, the detailed maintenance ledger showing years of costs. The fire marshal's visit that afternoon turned into an unexpected vantage. When he reviewed the situation and realized the implications of the HOA's position for public safety and insurance validity, Inspector Bill Harper walked the land with me, physically pointing to vulnerability in the current setup that have been masked by the HOA's false claims of ownership and control over infrastructure. Mr. Bennett, without legal access, this road is a fuse, and one spark means no one gets out safely during a wildfire evacuation, he said, making notes on his tablet with genuine concern. If this road isn't publicly maintained and the HOA doesn't have a legal easement, we need to update our emergency response protocols immediately to reflect the actual ownership situation accurately. He explained that if they're claiming ownership without prepared documentation, that could affect mutual aid agreements and insurance liability for every house in this valley, potentially voiding coverage entirely overnight. More importantly, every insurance policy might be invalid if the properties don't have documented legal access, which would make mortgages immediately callable and potentially bankrupt homeowners who couldn't pay off loans, and he promised to file his own report with the county about the access situation, which would force an official determination rather than letting Veronica wage war through complaints and petitions alone. Claire called that evening with an update that made me actually smile for the first time in days, despite everything that was happening around me with the escalating conflict. The county attorney's office declined to pursue the TTRO after reviewing our documentation, she said, triumph clear in her voice even over the phone connection from her office. They specifically cited the maintenance accords and the 1947 easement language as determinative factors showing continuous private ownership without abandonment or dedication to public use ever occurring. The prescriptive use claim had died before it could even get a hearing, which meant Veronica would have to find another angle of attack or admit defeat and negotiate properly. The gate installation happened Thursday morning, nothing aggressive or fortress-like that would give ammunition to complaints. Just a simple automated gate with keypad and camera system for documentation. The private road sign was prominently displayed along with emergency vehicles exempt and reflective lettering and clear instructions for requesting access that any reasonable person could follow without difficulty or confusion. I programmed codes for everyone who had gotten temporary passes, making sure the system was convenient for legitimate residents while establishing undeniable control over the access point that no court could ignore. The gate contractor, an older guy who'd seen plenty of property disputes, mentioned something interesting while setting up the system that made me think about long-term implications for the valley. You might want to consider speed bumps or traffic calming measures down the line. he suggested, pointing to tire marks on the asphalt that showed excessive speed from impatient drivers. Looks like people have been treating this like a raceway, and that kind of wear and tear adds up quick on private roads, especially if you're paying for maintenance yourself indefinitely. Inspector Harper's follow-up email that evening contained a detailed analysis of fire code implications if the HOA lacked proper easement documentation, and his conclusion was stark enough to make me whistle in disbelief. Every insurance policy in the valley could be voided if properties didn't have legal access rights, which would make mortgages callable and potentially bankrupt every homeowner overnight who couldn't immediately pay off their loan. When I looked at Harper's file showing the catastrophic implications for the HOA's insurance standing, I had to wonder if I was looking at leverage that would end this peacefully or ammunition for an all-out war. If the gate was the first battle line, tomorrow would draw the second across a courtroom, or worse, my front porch. Inspector Diane Harper arrived Tuesday morning with a team of 3 investigators, their white van pulling up to my property just as Thiessen cleared the eastern ridge, painting everything gold. She stepped out carrying a metal clipboard and wearing a hard hat that meant business, not some ceremonial prop for show. Her expression serious as she surveyed the property. Mr. Burnett, based on the preliminary findings and Fire Marshal Harper's report, we need to conduct a comprehensive site inspection of all unauthorized and damaging modifications to your property, she announced. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many property crimes disguised as improvements. And Mr. Mac turned as Harper's flashlight landed on fresh scarring in the earth. Her team spread out with measuring tapes, cameras, and devices that beeped when they found underground utilities, documenting everything with their precision of crime scene investigators. Within an hour, Harper had identified what she called a series of unauthorized and damaging modifications that made her shake, her head in disbelief at the sheer audacity of it all. They've trenched through your property here for utility lines without permits or notification, she said, pointing to fresh scarring in the earth that someone had tried to cover with loose soil. These trees they cleared along your eastern boundary, that's timber theft, and based on the ring count of these stumps, some of these pines were over 80 years old, and me grandfather once told me to never let the land be carved without consent, and seeing those stumps felt like watching his wisdom get chainsawed into nothing. She pulled out her tablet, showing me photographs from the county's area from last year compared to current conditions, and the difference was shocking. The roadway expansion evidence was even more damning than the unauthorized clearing and utility work, combined with Harper's team finding systematic encroachment along the entire eastern boundary of my property. Harper showed me a map overlay where 15 feet stolen on paper looked like an amputation in reality. The original roadage moved by nearly that much in places. They had paved over my grandfather's carefully maintained drainage ditches, the ones he dug by hand in the 60s to prevent erosion during spring runoff from the mountains. This isn't just encroachment, Harper explained, calculating on her tablet while her team measured every violation with laser precision and photographic documentation for the record. This is deliberate infrastructure theft valued at approximately $200,000 in improvements they made to your property without permission. She categorized the damages into 3 groups for her report: infrastructure at $120,000, environmental damage at $50,000 for the mature trees, and restoration costs at $30,000. That's when Claire called with news that changed everything, her voice excited, but controlled like a poker player holding a royal flush and trying not to show it. Grant, I found something in the archives that Veronica definitely doesn't know about, she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background as she gathered evidence. The deed has a non-transferable easement clause that I mentioned before, but there's more to it that I just discovered in the original filing. She explained that the clause specifically stated that any transfer of access rights required written consent from the property owner, not just for the HOA, but for each individual property. The chain of custody for this document was ironclad, filed with the county in 1947, referenced in every subsequent deed, but apparently never actually read by anyone. Veronica's been selling homes with promised access to A-Rod she doesn't control, and can't grant rights to. Claire continued, the implications hanging heavy between us. I didn't just own land, I owned leverage. And they never saw it coming because they had been too arrogant to check the actual paperwork properly. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore, but about every property deed in the valley potentially having a fatal flaw that could unravel millions in transactions. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Veronica herself, arriving alone, in her Lexus without her usual entourage of board members to back her up or witness her actions. She walked up to my cabin with an envelope in her hand, trying to project confidence, but unable to hide the tremor in her fingers as she clucked at Mr. Bennet. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," she said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace of someone in physical pain. "I'd like to resolve this matter privately without involving lawyers or causing unnecessary difficulty for our community." She held out the envelope, which I could see contained cash through the partially open flap, a thick stack of hundreds that represented her first attempt at bribery. I'd prepared for this possibility with Deputy Ward, who'd given me a small vial of UV powder that would mark the bills and anyone who handled them for evidence. Part of me wanted to throw the envelope back at her, but the smarter part let her own grave by accepting it and playing along. "I'm listening," I said, taking the envelope carefully and thumbing through the bills while the invisible powder did its work, coating divining with traceable evidence. "This is $20,000 cash," Veronica said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper like she was afraid of being overheard. "Just to sign a simple easement agreement, maintains the status quo and drops all the inspection nonsense." The desperation in her voice told me she knew how bad things were about to get for her and the HOA she'd turned into her personal kingdom. I pretended to consider it while texting Ward under the table, then shook my head slowly like I was genuinely conflicted about taking her dirty money. "I need to think about this, Veronica, but I'll keep the money while I decide," I said, watching her elect slightly at what she thought was progress. Within 5 minutes of her leaving, Ward arrived to bag the bills as evidence using a UV light to show the powder glowing on my hands and Veronica's hands. The faint violet glow in her fingers felt like a silent confession written in light proof of her attempted bribery that she couldn't wash away. "That's attempted bribery of a property owner to influence a legal matter," Ward said, sealing the evidence bag with satisfaction, clear in his voice. Friday morning, the County de Sofas called to inform me they were opening a formal investigation into civil and consumer fraud charges against the HOA board based on submitted evidence. "We're not pursuing criminal charges yet," the assistant DA explained carefully, "but the evidence suggests a pattern of deceptive practices that violates consumer protection laws." The state attorney general's office was monitoring the situation, but letting the county handle it initially, though they reserved the right to step in if interstate issues emerged. By afternoon, a contractor who'd done work for the HOA had come forward with invoices and emails showing Veronica had personally directed him to move survey stakes, shuttled me it was HOA property, and showed me those doctored maps, the contractor explained, providing screenshots of text messages with GPS coordinates. His testimony, combined with the physical evidence and Harper's inspection report, painted a picture of deliberate, calculated theft disguised as community improvement that had been ongoing for years. I spent the evening organizing everything into a comprehensive little, preparing for what I knew would be the crucial community meeting where everything would come to a head. The audio of Veronica bragging about burying people in legal fees played in my head on repeat, her confidence suggesting she'd gotten away with this before. As I sat there organizing evidence into folders labeled by date and type, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank Dalton about Veronica's past in Colorado. When I opened the said public records request he'd filed, it showed Veronica had done exactly this scheme 5 years ago in Durango. And yet, with the valley shifting beneath her feet and evidence mounting against her, I had the uneasy feeling Veronica wasn't finished yet. The community hall was packed beyond capacity. Saturday evening, cars overflowing the parking lot and lining the access road I now controlled, creating a traffic jam of anxious neighbors waiting for answers. No one touched the coffee station in the corner, and even the donuts stayed untouched. The tension in the room so thick it killed everyone's appetite completely as they waited for the truth. I arrived early to set up my presentation, keeping it simple with just 3 poster boards instead of a complex slideshow that might lose people in technical details they didn't need to understand. The nervous energy was palpable as neighbors filed, in some avoiding eye contact while others nodded supportively, everyone knowing this meeting would determine the valley's fate for generations to come. Veronica sat at the board table up front with her 2 remaining allies, trying to project authority despite the investigation news that had spread through the community like wildfire over the past week. I stood up when called, walking to the front, with my evidence boards while conversations died to absolute silence. Every eye tracking my movement to the podium where truth would finally be revealed. What you're about to see is proof of systematic fraud that's put every one of your homes at risk, and I need you to understand the full scope of what's been done. I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. I revealed the first board showing The Gisavale the analyst had created with the original property lines in green and the HOA's altered version in red. The manipulation obvious to anyone with eyes. The red lines of HOA manipulation cut across the map like wounds, showing exactly where they'd stolen from me and put everyone's property at risk, legally through deliberate falsification of documents. One woman gasped audibly when she saw how close the alterations committed her own property line, and another cursed under her breath, finally understanding the danger they had all been in. The second board showed the insurance underwriter's letter displayed in enlarged text for everyone to read, clearly stating in unambiguous terms that without valid legal access, coverage could be voided immediately. Claire had obtained this letter from the largest insurer in the valley, and it applied to every policy they held, which was most of the neighborhood, including people who'd lived here for decades. Your mortgages could be called in tomorrow if your insurance lapses, I explained, letting the weight of that information sink in as people pulled out phones to photograph the board for their records. Every single one of you is at risk right now, because of fraudulent claims about road ownership that were never true and can't be made true retroactively, no matter what the hoax. The murmuring that started was worried rather than angry people suddenly realizing their big jest investing might evaporate overnight because of Veronica's schemes and lies built over years. The third board content, the custody log for all evidence, showing Ward's signature, Harper's stamp, and the county DA's file in Amore in bold print, that meant this was officially a criminal matter now. Everything has been documented by law enforcement and is part of an active investigation that will likely result in criminal charges, I said, making eye contact with as many neighbors as possible to convey the seriousness. The fraud is real, the evidence is overwhelming, and the consequences are coming whether you sign tonight's agreement or not, but signing protects you from the fallout. The room erupted in angry voices directed at Veronica, who stood up so fast her chair fell backward, with a crash that echoed through the hall like a gunshot announcing war. These are fabrications designed to destroy our community values that we've worked years to build, Veronica shouted, her face flushed red with rage and desperation. You're all sheep being led to slaughter, she screamed completely, losing her composure in front of everyone who'd trusted her with their community leadership and their financial future. For years without question, you'd let him burn this community down just to prove a point about some ancient property lines that should have been changed years ago. Chairs scraped as people physically leaned away from Hero burst, the board members beside her actually moving their chairs to create distance from someone clearly spiraling out of control. The panic in her voice when she tried to answer questions about mortgages and insurance only made things worse, her carefully constructed authority crumbling in real time as neighbors shouted questions. That's when the man who leaked the emails stood up from the back row holding up his phone with the audio file ready to play for everyone to hear the truth. I think everyone needs to hear what Veronica really thinks about burying people in legal fees until they lose everything, he said, hitting play before anyone could stop him from exposing her. Veronica's recorded voice filled the room, talking about crushing me with litigation costs and how mountain people ways fold, and the silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Several board members physically moved their chairs away from Veronica, distancing themselves from someone they suddenly realized might drag them down into criminal charges and financial ruin. Claire stood to explain the memorandum of understanding that would resolve everything cleanly without destroying anyone's life, unnecessarily keeping her explanation brief but comprehensive and clear. $30 per household per month for legal road access, guaranteed in perpetuity for you and your heirs with a restoration bond to fix the damage already done to Mr. Bennett's property. Sign tonight and if everything stays stable with your homes protected. Legally, Claire continued, passing out copies efficiently, so wagger hands reaching for salvation from this mess. Don't sign and you're gambling with your property's future in ways that could cost you everything you've worked for in this valley. $30 a month was cheaper than losing your home to avoided mortgage, and everyone in that room could do that math quickly enough to see the obvious choice. Tom Chen, our squared at these meetings, signed first, muttering, "Let's stop the bleeding before it gets worse." As his pen moved across the paper with decisive strokes, within an hour, 87% of the homeowners had signed the agreement, including 2 of Veronica's board members who publicly resigned their positions while signing documents. The holdouts were mostly Veronica's inner circle, but even they looked uncertain as they watched their neighbors choosing security over loyalty to a leader who'd betrayed them all with lies. Someone asked about the criminal investigation and what it meant for board members, and I confirmed the DA was moving forward with charges including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Anyone who participated in falsifying documents or signatures held consult their own attorney immediately before the investigation expands, I added, watching several Francesco pale with realization. Veronica finally snapped completely when someone asked if she'd really stolen from another family in Colorado, using these same tactics to take their land through legal exhaustion. Then she made her biggest mistake, shoving the email leaker hard enough that he stumbled backward into a table, sending cups and papers flying everywhere in a cascade of chaos. Multiple phones captured the assault from different angles. Bedonce and Ward, who had been observing quietly from the back, immediately moved forward with professional authority. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for simple assault," he said, producing handcuffs while reciting her rights as the entire room watched in stunned silence at her complete downfall. The sight of Veronica being lit out in handcuffs while cursing everyone in sight was something no one in that room would ever forget or stop talking about. After Ward left with her, the remaining board members asked if I'd consider being reasonable about castration costs given the HOA's limited budget and their cooperation going forward. 12000 to cover the damage documented by the inspector. I said firmly, but no tonguingly, understanding their difficult position. "Paid over time with reasonable interest, but work starts within 30 days or I'll do it myself and lean in HOA assets to recover costs." But as the signatures piled up and order returned to the chaos, I noticed someone slipping out the back door, quietly, phone still in hand. Monday morning, I sat with Claire at the county recorder's office, signing the permanent easement agreement that would govern the valley's road access for generations to come. As the seal hit the paper, I felt something in me chest finally exhale, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks without realizing it until that moment. The document was elegant in its simplicity, granting perpetual access for $30 per household per month. Adjusted annually for inflation with transparent accounting requirements. My grandfather always said, "Ink on land is louder than any shout," and today, it roared through the valley with the force of justice finally served. Emergency vehicles had absolute priority. The signage requirements were minimal but clear, and any future changes required a 75% vote of all property owners. "This protects everyone," Claire said as we watched the clerk stamp it official, "including future owners who won't have to worry about another Veronica situation." The court's 3-year no-contact order protecting my property from Veronica arrived that same afternoon, prohibiting her from coming within 500 feet of any Bennett family trust land. The judge had also frozen her assets pending the outcome of both criminal and civil proceedings, which meant she couldn't liquidate and run like she'd done in Colorado. The HOA board, now under emergency management by elected volunteers, had voted to pursue a restoration bond of $120,000 to repair the damage immediately. Combined with her legal fees and the frozen assets from multiple judgments, her financial empire built on intimidation was crumbling faster than anyone had anticipated. But Veronica's personal search charge hit her even harder than the criminal charges, with the board levying a $90,000 judgment for breach of fiduciary duty. The forensic accounting revealed she'd misused HOA funds for personal expensoring contractors for her own property while billing the association without authorization or documentation. The sign with her name came down from the community centers. Her white Lexus was gone from the valley and her name had been scraped off the mailbox. Wednesday brought news that criminal charges had been formally filed against Veronica for fraud, forgery, and assault, with potential sentences totaling up to 12 years if convicted. Her husband was named as a co-conspirator in the fraud charges, and their real estate license was suspended pending investigation by the state board. The Colorado victims had also filed civil suits seeking damages for what Veronica had done to them 5 years ago, creating a cascade of legal problems. By Friday, the restoration work had begun on my property, with crews carefully removing the illegal pavement and restoring the natural drainage my grandfather had assigned decades ago. The scent of cedar from new saplings reminded me of summer mornings decades ago when grandfather and I would walk the property line together checking for damage. The mature trees couldn't be replaced quickly, but HOA's insurance would cover planting new ones and maintaining them until they reached maturity. The unauthorized utility lines were properly documented and easements filed, making them legal while ensuring I was compensated for their presence on my land. Watching the land heal from the damage felt like seeing justice in physical form. Every shred of dirt, a small victory against those who had tried to steal. The residents' apologies came in various forms over the following weeks, some written, others verbal, a few with small gifts of baked goods or preserved foods. A teenage girl who'd egged my cabin weeks ago during the height of the conflict left a hand-drawn note that simply said, "Sorry, I didn't know." I heard the same theme repeatedly in different voices, saying, they should have spoken up, should have questioned Veronica's authority, should have been better neighbors. One neighbor, who had been out of the country during the worst of it, personally apologized for his forged signature being used against me. Another brought her famous apple pie and admitted she'd been afraid of becoming Veronica's next target if she'd defended me cabin publicly. Maybe they weren't just my neighbors now. After years of HOA division, maybe we were becoming something more like an actual community. The local news picked up the story, running a segment on HOA overreach that featured our valley as a cautionary tale for other communities facing similar situations. The camera panned across my porch swing, creaking gently in the breeze, unchanged and undefeated. After all the attempts to force its remove accompli, the reporter interviewed several neighbors, who admitted they'd never actually read their HOA documents or questioned the board's claims about property boundaries until too late. The segment ended with a shot of my cabin looking exactly as it had for 60 years. While the reporter noted that sometimes preserving history requires fighting, a grassroots transparency measure passed at the next county commissioner meeting requiring all HOA to file annual reports showing their property boundaries verified against county records. The measure, nicknamed the Bennett Rule by locals, also required recorded board meetings and public access to all non-confidential HOA documents for transparency permanently. Not a revenge law, but a protection spell written in policy to prevent future fraud and abuse of power by HOA boards across the county. Several other counties in the state were considering similar measures, turning our valley's nightmare into a catalyst for broader reform that might protect others. The law firm that had provided legal counsel to Veronica during her scheme received a letter from the state bar requiring mandatory ethics training. Their involvement in preparing documents with falsified boundaries had crossed ethical lines, even if they claimed ignorance of the fraud entirely. The summer BBQ happened on a perfect July evening. The barn doors open wide with lights strung between the rafters my grandfather had raised decades ago. The same meadow where I had been now echoed with laughter from children playing and adults sharing stories over cold beer and grilled food peacefully. The same neighbors who'd stood silent during the confrontation now brought their families, their dishes, their laughter filling the space that had been locked against me. Children played in the meadow while adults shared stories and cold beer. The valley feeling like a community for the first time since I'd inherited the property. Frank pulled me aside as the sun set behind the western ridge, the golden light making the valley look like something from a painting. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled this," he said quietly, his beer bottle raised in a subtle toast to both past and present victories. Frank raised his beer properly. I raised mine in response, and somewhere my grandfather was smiling at the restoration of both land and community. He always said, "This land would take care of the family that took care of it," and you proved him right by standing your ground. Standing there watching my neighbors enjoy themselves on my property, sharing food under the same roof that Veronica had tried to steal, I realized something. Maybe this wasn't about winning a fight or defeating an enemy who'd attacked my family had built over generations of stewardship. Maybe it was about proving we could live here as a real community without the HOA's manufactured drama, without someone waving bylaws like weapons, and definitely without fake authority claiming ownership over every porch and blade of grass. The valley had found its balance again after months of quiet threats and louder resistance.